Hello everybody and welcome again to chesslecture.com. This is International Master Dave Vigorito, and today I'm going to start a short series looking at an interesting opening variation that I think is kind of useful for both colors. So I think that this series could be aimed at players with white or black. The series will be on the English opening, the 4 knights variation, which will go c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6. There's different move orders, and I'll kind of get to that. Knight f3, knight c6. So this is very old opening system that I think probably black should be able to equalize without a lot of difficulty, but it's interesting to play for white too, because white can fight for the initiative. Maybe it's not as scary theoretically as some openings, but the main thing is it tends to lead to interesting play where both sides can try to win. And for white, the plus is that there's a lot of different lines that you can play, and that's kind of how I've approached this line as white. Is there's a few things I can play here, so I can mix it up. It's kind of thing that's maybe if you just know it better than your opponent, then you can do quite well with it. And I've done quite well with white, and I played it sometimes as black as well. So let me kind of just talk about the move orders. This first part is really just going to kind of be an introduction, and then in the later parts I will cover some of the main variations. The kind of in the opposite order I will present them. The most important one is probably G3, and then E3 is another main line. And then there's kind of two central lines, D4, which is very direct, and E4. So all these lines I'll kind of present possibilities for both colors. But today I'm just going to look at kind of the move orders to get here, and then just a couple of the more minor possibilities for white. So if we start here with C4, E5. Now, knight c3 is the most common move, but sometimes white will play g3 too. So for black, I'll give a couple options here, because for white I'll be covering, just the 4 knights. Now, if black against the g3 lines with the 4 knights likes to play an open variation, like with d5, like the accelerated dragon, then it becomes quite easy, because you can play knight f6, bishop g2, d5, reverse dragon I should say, not accelerated. cd, knight takes d5, knight c3, knight b6, knight f3, knight c6. So how this would normally come about would be, from our 4 knights, would be c4, e5, knight c3, knight f6. Now if g3, then d5 as well, but knight f3, knight c6, g3, d5, takes, bishop g2, knight to b6. So if you like this line for black, this reverse Sicilian, where black is generally going to play bishop e7 and castle, then this could be played against white's move order with g3 and move 2 as well. Now, after g3, black also sometimes plays bishop to c5 or bishop to b4 is really the other main line. So if you want to do that, then things are a little different, because g3, knight f6, bishop to g2, it's just suddenly not possible, really, to play bishop to b4, because white would just play a3, and the bishop, would have to retreat to e7 or something. So here there's a couple independent possibilities. One would be to play c6, the idea of playing d5, and this is now like a reversed c3 Sicilian, but there's some differences, because white's up a tempo, and he's already committed to the fianchetto. So here white has a couple of choices. He could do knight f3, e4, knight d4. Or more commonly, white would play d4, ed, queen takes d4, with the idea of playing against an isolated pawn at some point, like getting this structure. So if you don't mind these kinds of positions for black with an isolated pawn, then that's a line to consider. But what would be more consistent with what I'm going to present is when black likes to play bishop to b4, bishop c5. Now, if black wants to play bishop c5, you can simply play knight c6, knight c3, bishop c5. Now here white does have a possibility other than knight f3, because you can play e3. And now here there's already an interesting gambit possibility with d5, cd, and knight b4. And the idea is that the knight attacks here, and if white chooses to protect that pawn with queen b3 or e4, which is rather ugly, then black would have knight to d3 check, and we get a certain compensation making the king move. But black would have to be prepared for this kind of sharp game. Now the other possibility for black I find quite interesting, and recently Eugene looked at a game with this line, with this funny move h6. And this looks kind of ludicrous at first, but one idea is that black wants to play bishop b4, so he has to wait for the knight to be there. And it turns out in a lot of these positions that are really like a reversed Rossolimo Sicilian, like e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. In those positions, the move h3 is often useful. So here black takes it a step further and plays h6, figuring it would be useful. So one possibility would be like knight c3, then bishop to b4. This is black's idea. Black hopes to inflict the doubled pawns. And if white avoids that, if he does e3, then d5 makes sense because white is weak in this square. If knight f3, black can play knight to c6. And if e4, then bishop to c5. Now the bishop has a good square. One possibility for white here would be maybe to play a3 to stop bishop e4. And black maybe could just play a5 even. Knight c3, bishop c5. It's still a possibility, but this is just an interesting kind of possibility for black if white plays the g3 move order. But I don't want to get sidetracked too much, because basically I'm going to be covering the 4 knights. Now, from white's point of view, the move knight c3 would be necessary to aim for the 4 knights. And here black has 2 main lines, knight c6 or knight f6. The other possibility is bishop to b4. And here white should probably play knight d5. If you don't play knight d5, then black will probably take here at some point, which is a common theme in the 4 knights as well. But here black has not committed his knight yet, so maybe it would go to e7. Black could also play something like f5, like g3 takes. Maybe black can play f5 and get a setup like this, with the ideas like castles and d6 and almost like a Dutch defense. But white has these doubled pawns. It's still unclear, but a lot of players will try to avoid this with white. So the main move would be knight to d5, and then the kind of old line was to play bishop a5, b4, c6, ba, cd, cd. With an unclear position that tends to favor white because of the bishop pair. More solid for black would be bishop to e7, which looks kind of submissive to just retreat the bishop where it can be taken. But it turns out black ends up with quite a solid position. And in the event that white takes on e7, which he usually will at some point, probably not right away, but just to see the contours of the position, black can take with a queen and play like d6, maybe f5, but even knight f6. And it's not necessarily so dissimilar from a position where black had taken on c3, and maybe white had taken with a queen or something. So it's still quite solid for black. Black gets rid of his dark bishop, and then puts his pawn on dark squares. Now, the main continuations are knight moves. So knight c6 kind of signals black intention to play like a reverse closed Sicilian. Now if g3, then g6. Here, knight f6 isn't quite as good, because knight to f6, bishop g2, bishop b4, white has knight d5, is a little more annoying for black. But g3, g6, these close Sicilian positions, reverse, tend to be about equal. The close Sicilian is not considered so dangerous when white plays it, but even with an extra tempo, it doesn't make a whole lot of difference. It makes some difference, but typically neither side has much of an initiative in this kind of structure, and it's just kind of, about who outplays the opponent strategically. Now, black's other move order would be to play knight f6. And this, in some ways, it's a little more aggressive, a little more tactical. Then if white plays g3, black has the option between bishop b4, which is really a reverse Rossolimo in its purest sense, with white having the extra move g3. So again, black is aiming to double the pawns. And black, again, as mentioned before, has the option of going into reverse dragon with d5. And then there's a third option to play c6. And here this is a little more annoying, because if d4 takes, d5, it's more likely that this knight could be a target. For example, takes, bishop g2, knight c6, and then maybe d4 will follow, hitting the knight. So the knight is there a little early. And here white could also play like knight f3, and then we head to a similar position that I mentioned before. That's like a reverse Alapin Sicilian. But the main move that we will look at will be knight f3. And here white could play this against either move. And in this position, black is kind of forced into knight c6. Could play d6 when white can either do g3 with kind of a good closed Sicilian, because this knight is here very early. Or white could play d4, kind of aiming for like a King's Indian or even an Old Indian structure. With variations, it should favor white a little bit. Note that here, white can still play knight f3, and then if f5, I also did a lecture with my game against Bizgeyer, where after g3, knight f6, I showed this possibility, d4, e4, and then a very interesting move, knight h4. So that's my lecture against Bizgeyer. But finally, we come around to knight f6. So as I mentioned, the moves that we will concentrate on in parts 2, 3, 4, and 5 will be d4, e4, e3, and g3. Those are really the main moves. Now there's two other moves I'm going to consider today. One is a3. So this is an interesting move. Idea, obviously, to stop bishop to b4. Another idea is that if black plays for a open Sicilian reversed, d5, cd, knight d5, Sicilian players will know that usually the move a6 in a Sicilian is useful, and here it's also true a3 is useful. So here white could play e3 or d3, but most aggressively would be e4, because now it's like a reverse Sveshnikov, but there's no move knight to b5. So, here white could maybe have some chances of an advantage. But here I think the theoretical issue would be black can play g6. Because if we get a closed formation, let's say g3, bishop g7, bishop g2, castles, castles, d6, d3, at some point white will play b4, and then b5, but then this a-pawn will have to move again. So there's no reason for black to play a5 here. Black can instead play a thematic move like h6, b4, bishop e6, b5, knight e7, let's say bishop b2, queen d7. But here white's extra move a3 is quite useless, and if anything, white's going to have to just play a4 soon anyway, in which case he will be losing a tempo, and it will be almost like he is playing the black pieces. Now, it's true this would be in a relatively harmless line, because it's like a closed Sicilian, but, we just have like an equal position. So this move a3 is kind of interesting if you like these kinds of positions, but should not lead to any advantage. So the other move I'm going to look at today, that I've actually played several times, even though honestly it should not be so dangerous theoretically, is d3, which is kind of a sneaky move. And this move has some transpositional possibilities. If d5, which is not bad, takes, white could play g3, just going into one of these reverse dragon positions. But here in a reverse dragon, as we'll see later, white usually does not rush to play the move d3, oftentimes preferring to play on the queen side first with moves like a3 and b4 and rook b1. So here black could say he has a slightly better version of reverse dragon. At least white's position is less flexible. White could, of course, play like a3 or e4 with like a reversed Boleslavsky Sicilian. And a Boleslavsky Sicilian would be like if the colors were reversed and black, who would be white, had this move bishop e7 here immediately. The difference here is, let's say after a move like knight f3, in the reverse position, this bishop would already be here. So white would maybe even consider a move like h3, which would be h6 reversed. But typically in this structure, the two moves that black can play to fight for this square, which is kind of the key square because it's been weakened by white's pawn moves, would be to play bishop to c5 or bishop to g4. So here white cannot prevent both. Now if this bishop was already here and we were black, maybe we would play h3, allowing the bishop to come here because then it would lose a tempo. But here we can't stop both moves, so if white plays h3, then bishop c5 should be okay. And if white chooses to stop that move instead, with bishop e3, then probably bishop g4, fighting for this square, would be okay. So here's a case where like reversed opening does not have such a tremendous effect. Now, black has other moves here too, like bishop c5 would be reasonable. Well, bishop b4 is okay too. Now, here white could play g3, reaching kind of a relatively harmless closed variation, where d3 would be played very early. White could also play e4, and this will transpose to a position in the e4 variation on move 4, which we will look at later. And that line instead would be e4 and move 4, then bishop b4, d3, reaching the same position. The other option for white would be to play bishop to d2, castles. And now this position is kind of like a bishop b5 Sicilian, like if white played e4, c5, knight f3, knight c6, bishop b5. So if we look at this for a moment, and here yet again we'll see why some reversed openings don't work so well because their purpose is different. So if we look at this line, castles, bishop d7, knight c3, and now let's say a6, takes, e5, takes, rook c8, position is about equal, maybe takes, and we have this structure, really it's fine for both sides. Black's behind in development, but white can't really open the position any further. It's not going to be so easy to force d4. So black can maybe play knight f6, e6, bishop e7, and it's even. So now if we look at this reversed, bishop d2, castles, a3, takes. We see we have the same position, but white has this extra move here. Now black could play rook e8, but then maybe e4, keeping the position closed, while white is behind in development. White has the two bishops, but he's behind in development, so he needs to keep things kind of safe for now, and he can try to open the position later. But black can also play e4, so now it's actually attacking the knight. And one point here, and this is true reversed, is if bishop f6, removing the defender of the e-pawn, takes, this is not so good because just queen takes b2, and white's pawns are disjointed. And if takes on e4, knight takes, rook c1, knight takes c3, rook takes c3. We see we have the exact same position. White has this extra move for free, but the position is essentially equal. Nobody has the initiative, so even the extra tempo is not enough to make it so that white has an advantage. So these are kind of the ways that black can meet these relatively uncommon lines with a3 on move 4 or d3 on move 4. So in the next few parts we will look at the main continuations, d4, e4, e3, and especially g3. So until then, thank you for joining us on chesslecture.com.